Here's the task I've set myself for the things I want to say. I want to show you as best I can how the chaotic events since January 20th, the inauguration of Donald Trump, how they fit together, how they make, if you understand their underlying messages and goals, how they make a certain sense that we need to understand if we're going to change this system in the ways that people like you and me think about and hope for. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to start with the big picture and then work my way down to the specifics that we've been reading about in the newspaper. And if some of this strikes you as different from what you've heard, good. Then I will be getting across what it is I want to do. Because the mass media have made a chaotic situation much worse by the incoherent, fragmentary, contradictory way bits and pieces of the story are presented to us. If you add to that a style of Mr. Trump's government, which is herky-jerky, on again, off again, it makes it even harder for a press that isn't up to the job anyway to give you a coherent story. So around most of the world, and I just came back from Europe a couple of weeks ago, there's mostly the answer to the question, what is going on in the United States, is a shrug of the shoulders, a confused roll of the eyes, and a kind of conversation doesn't last very long. So it's that I want to challenge with what I'm about to say. Okay, here we go. The most important single idea I want to leave with you is that we, that is you and I and the people alive around the world today, are living through a very historical moment. And by that I mean the end of the American empire. It is really important that we understand that is the big picture we're looking at. This is an empire that replaced a previous empire, the British Empire. How far down you can go from being a global empire is illustrated, if you ever want to learn about it, by just going to England or reading the statistics of a society that is now returning to what it originally was, a cold, wet, offshore island of the continent of Europe, not the master of the world, not the great naval power, none of it. Their leaders, their institutions are in an advanced state of decline, and it's worth looking at it because their present is our future. We lost the war in Vietnam. The Communist Party of Vietnam is in charge there. We lost the war in Afghanistan. The Taliban is in charge there. We lost the war in Iraq since the Shiite and Sunni parts of that country remain the dominant political force. The only difference is great hostility to the United States. And we are now in the process of losing the war in Ukraine. That's not a thriving empire, that's a dying empire. But more than that is the economics of it all. And allow me to take 2 or 3 minutes just to drive that home. For most of the last 75 years after World War II, the United States was the economic powerhouse of the world. All the other potential challengers of the dominant position of the United States were destroyed in and by World War II. Germany, France, Italy, Russia, China, Japan, all destroyed, losing millions of people, railroads gone, factories gone, all of it. In the United States, it was the opposite. World War II brought us out of a great capitalist depression. And by 1945, we were absolutely dominant. The old empire, the British, which had provided the British pound as the global currency, was pushed out of the story, and the new global currency, which is what it still is to this day, is the US dollar. Anywhere in the world that needed help to develop their economy went to Washington and New York to get that done. From the Marshall Plan right after the war, right up until the present. Until about 30 years ago. Even the end of colonialism, the freeing of the old European colonies after World War II, led by the revolt of the Indians in India against the British, even the great colonial rebellions did not free the rest of the world from the dominance of the United States economically and therefore also politically. Independence turned out to make very little difference. This situation extended everywhere across the world as capitalism replaced other systems and brought the United States to a peak of global dominance for most of the second half of the 20th century. And then something happened, which you'll see I come back to over and over again. Even as the Soviet Union, an alternative of sorts, hit a rocky road in the 1970s that eventually brought it to an implosion and it disappeared. Something had happened in China, far away from the United States, and something which the United States tried to prevent, as usual, failed to prevent, also usual, allowing the Chinese to be isolated by the United States, much as the United States had used the policy of isolation to limit the Soviet Union. They did the same with China. But China learned something from the Soviet Union. It learned how to transform its isolation into an advantage. And I will come back to that because it's crucial. But for the moment, here's what happened to the global economy. The Chinese developed a new and different economic arrangement. They didn't do what the West did with private capitalism. And they did not do what the Soviet Union did, with the state replacing the private sector as the owner and operator of industry. What the Chinese did, and we will keep coming back to it, is develop an altogether new way of organizing a hybrid, 50% private capitalist and 50% government-owned and operated industry. It's what the Chinese mean when they talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. What the Chinese have done has no parallel in human history. In 30 years, maybe 40 if you want to be generous, they accomplished an economic development that took centuries in the West and that took many decades and didn't get as far in the Soviet Union. They are a unique form of the modern economic systems of the world. And their achievement has been to go from the worst poverty in the planet to becoming the second superpower after the United States. Again, no comparable achievement in any society, let alone a huge and very poor one. And that has meant everything. The Chinese now have developed a group of nations. You know this, it's called the BRICS. Began with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and now has a dozen more countries, either partners or becoming members. It's important that you understand that the BRICS, China and its allies, and it has to be put that way because China is the dominant player here. China and its allies, the BRICS, include more than half the people on this planet. The population of the United States is 4.5% of the people on this planet. China and the BRICS produce about 33% of the output of goods and services that this planet achieves each year. The United States and its major allies, called the G7, that's the United States, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, Canada, and Germany combined, produce about 28%. China and the BRICS are the largest, richest part of the global empire, and that displaces the United States and its allies to a distant second position. And that changes everything. Every third world country, every part of the global south, if they need a loan, if they want a market, if they want a railroad built, if they want to develop the medical care in their society, they used to go to London or New York to beg and to plead and to hope. They still do that, but as soon as that trip is over, they go to New Delhi and Beijing and Sao Paulo and have the same discussion, and very often now get a better deal from the bigger, richer part of the world economy than they can get from the West, which is why everything is tilting against the United States. It's not this or that political decision. It's not even this or that president or this or that war. Something bigger and more profound and more long-lasting is underway. And because the empire was so crucial, it is also the case that the capitalist economic system of the United States is shrinking, is unable to function. It can't do what it used to do. It is being outcompeted left and right. Every day, every week brings more evidence. Quick example, 15 years ago, a competition around the world developed to replace the gasoline engine driving automobiles and trucks with electric vehicles. You all know the story. Well, many companies in many countries went to work competing to try to be the leader in the transition to electric vehicles. That competition is now over. The winner is something called the BYD Corporation. The letters standing for build your dream. The words are English. The company is Chinese. They produce the best electric vehicles at the lowest price. You cannot beat them. Everybody who has tried has failed. They now have the best battery system in China to fuel these cars. That game is over. Now, you don't know perhaps about the BYD vehicles because while they're on the road in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe, they're not on the road here. Why? Because first Mr. Trump put a tariff, 27%. Then Mr. Biden raised it to 100%. To buy a BYD car, you have to come up with $30,000 to get the car, and then you have to pay Uncle Sam the tariff of another $30,000, 100%. So the total cost of the car to you would be 60,000. Americans don't do that because they can buy much cheaper cars from General Motors or Tesla or Ford that are electric. They're not as good. And so over time, the rest of the world, every capitalist competing around the world with America, will be buying the best and the cheapest cars and trucks, while their American competitors can't do it. And they will lose as a result. And with it, the economics of American capitalism will be circling the bowl. And I assume you understand which bowl I'm referring to. This decline is what we are living through. When empires decline, and we know this from the history of the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, when empires decline, the people at the top, the richest, the most powerful, are the ones in the best position to hold on to what the empire made possible for them in the way of wealth and power and standard of living, which means that the costs of the declining empire are offloaded from the people at the top and concentrated on the people in the middle and the bottom. And that's what we are going through now. Mr. Trump is simply doing the work. In the interest of time, let me jump forward. The decline of American capitalism and the decline of the American empire is something that is taboo to discuss in the United States. We just had a presidential election, as you know, in which none of the three candidates said a word about empire or declining or our capitalism or anything like it. The Democratic Party is a really impressive program of what a psychologist would call mass denial. Everything I just said is denied. The Republicans are not much different, but they at least have a grip on something close to what I've said without any of the specificity. To choose a slogan, MAGA, is a way obliquely to admit something has been lost, something is gone. We need to go backwards to go get it again, as if that were possible. It is a recognition. And it meant that Mr. Trump had a bond with a lot of people who, in their guts somewhere, figured this out anyway, know it, and felt that he at least felt it too. Whereas from the Democrats, nothing. And they continue to offer basically nothing. One of the key points that all of this condenses down to is the budget of the United States as a government. So I need to spend 2 or 3 minutes on that otherwise boring subject with you. One of the signs of our decline is the fact that our government, particularly over the last 20 years, has gone very deeply into debt. It has gone into debt for two major reasons. One, the wars we fight forever. Vietnam, Afghanistan, all the others. Those are expensive. And in capitalist societies like ours, it is too dangerous for the people who run the country to pay for the war by taxing everybody. You want to see opposition to the war go crazy overnight? Then tell everybody in America how many thousands of dollars we're going to tax away from them above what they've been paying in order to cover the costs of the war. So we don't do that. We don't tax to pay for war. We borrow to pay for war. We borrowed for Vietnam, we borrowed for Afghanistan, and we're borrowing like crazy, both to fund Israel in Gaza and to fund Ukraine against Russia, as well as other warfares going on. But there's an even more profound reason our government goes into debt. Here it is. It's important to understand for our strategizing. If you divide the American people into corporations and the rich on the one hand, and the mass of employees on the other, here's what both of them want. The government should serve them. The government should provide for them. The government should subsidize them. They all say that. And they all say, I don't want to pay taxes. Now, the corporations and the rich have ways of avoiding taxes that average people don't. And so politicians are in an absurd situation. To win re-election, they dare not tax neither the corporations and the rich who give them the money to run politics, nor the mass of people who give them the votes. Yet they both want services which cost money. The solution in our capitalist system, and we're crazier in that than most other capitalist countries, the solution our politicians have found is to borrow the money. In that way, they can provide the services without taxing. And of course, corporations and the rich love this arrangement because they know that their real choice is either to be taxed by the government, which they don't want, or to have the government need to borrow. And who does it borrow from? From corporations and the rich. So for them, it's a no-brainer. Of course, we don't want to be taxed. We would rather give you a loan, buy your treasury securities. And so the government goes into debt. And with the additional costs of a declining empire, the debt becomes too much. And what do I mean too much? This game of borrowing more money, and for those of you who keep track, our national debt is now about $35–36 trillion. Our annual output of goods and services is about $25 trillion. So our debt is now in excess of our annual product, which is generally considered around the world danger zone. And why is that important? Because this game of American politics can only go on so long as somebody lends money to the United States on the scale that the United States borrows. The United States is the largest debtor country in the world. No one else is close. What is going on is that we are running out of the ability to keep this busted, declining system going. 3 weeks ago, an event that got very little attention, crucial. The United States government went to borrow money. The Japanese government, the largest lender to the United States, told the United States quietly, we're not lending you anymore because you're not safe as a place to lend money. All around the world, folks, rich people, big corporations who used to keep significant shares of their wealth in the United States aren't doing that anymore. They're cutting back on their holdings. If they bought 3 apartments on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, they've sold 1 or 2 of them and they've bought something else somewhere else in the world. They're spreading their risk away from the US. Since Mr. Trump was inaugurated, the US dollar has lost about 8 or 9% of its value against most other currencies. Why? Not simply because Mr. Trump is an erratic, strange character. That doesn't help. But it's a much deeper phenomena. And it isn't going to go away whether or not Mr. Trump remains the president for a longer or shorter period of time. Mr. Trump may seem to be crazy. He may seem to be mad, but there is a method here, and we would be remiss if we did not understand it. He doesn't want more wars because we can't afford them. And he wants to cut the government spending, like all Republicans, but now urgently because we can't keep borrowing to pay for the government spending. And they dare not tax corporations and the rich. So they're stuck. So, of course, they would try extraordinary things. Kick our allies in the face. Why not? If it reduces our need to go to war. Tell the Europeans, you want a war in Ukraine? You do it. We're not doing it. We're not spending that kind of money. And bring in a drugged out clown like Mr. Musk and have him fire huge numbers of people in a crazy efficiency action, which no one who's ever tried to bring efficiency to a bureaucracy would ever have done in that way, because that's crazy. But if you're desperate, you do new and different things. And that's what Mr. Trump is doing. However crazy it may seem, there is a logic here. But he has a problem, which takes us back, and this is my final thing, to the point of a dying empire. His problem is that what he's trying to do can only work if the rest of the world allows him to act in this way. For the second half of the 20th century, the rest of the world had to allow whoever the American president was to do whatever he wanted and go along with it. But that's no longer the case. What Mr. Trump and the Democrats can't face, the end of the American empire, is hobbling his ability. He throws a tariff, and we all wait to see what counteracting tariff, what retaliatory tariff will come. The United States thinks it can do what it used to do. It can't. That's reality, is what's coming home slowly but relentlessly. And along the way, unbelievable mistakes are being made. And those could do us damage of a sort that makes it only that much more urgent that we explain what is going on to our fellow citizens, because it's a logical step from there to why we need social change. The reality is, the United States thought it could destroy the Russians in the Ukraine. In the early weeks of the war, it was predicted by the president and all his advisors. The ruble would collapse, the Russians couldn't wage a successful war. All of that was wrong. And why was it wrong? Because it didn't count with the ability of Russia to turn to China and the BRICS to save them, which China and the BRICS did. The oil and gas Russia couldn't send anymore to Europe. They sold instead to China and India. The BRICS was the missing element that made the American decision to go into Ukraine an enormous mistake. By the way, the bombing of the Russian bases deep inside Russia that occurred earlier today is another big mistake. This doesn't work. Russia and China are now closely allied. They have a bigger nuclear arsenal than the United States, and together they have nearly 3 billion people against the 330 million of the United States. This is picking a fight you're gonna lose. And we live here. And we better come to terms with these realities. They were there before Mr. Trump, and they will be there after them. He has done nothing to change any of this. Absolutely nothing. And there's no sign that he will be able to do anything in the time that remains. As socialists, let me appeal to you. The common problem here is a capitalist system, particularly in the West, in the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Canada, based on private enterprises organizing every workplace with a small group of people at the top, the board of directors if it's a corporation, the owner operator of the business, and then underneath them a mass of employees. That very structure is deeply and totally undemocratic. The power of the owner of the business, the power of the board of directors is enormous, against which the power of the employees is trivial. There is no accountability that the employer has to the employees. It is a screamingly undemocratic arrangement and therefore is deeply vulnerable to a critique that begins with that fact and that advocates a socialism based on the notion that we can and we should democratize the enterprises of our society. That is something the American people could listen to and could get behind. And we could show how and why, if the employees were also collectively their own employer, which is what I'm talking about, then we wouldn't have the split we have now between what the employees need and want from the government and what the employers want. There'd be no split because those would be the same people. It is a powerful message. We have no reason to hesitate to run with it. But we have an opportunity beyond no reason not to. We have an opportunity now that I want to end with. The system we're facing is at a very weak point. Mr. Biden, Mr. Trump, and it would have been the same with Kamala Harris, they are now a government that is desperate. They may not know it yet, but they are feeling their way, even they, to the desperation out of which comes all of that stuff we see and hear every day. I've taken more than the time you asked me to take, so let me stop and be happy to discuss or respond in any way to anything that may come up in your minds as you think about what we've discussed here.